She let him in, not knowing he had the power to ruin or save her entire life. But what no one knew was that he wasn't just homeless. He was a billionaire, and he wanted only her. Imagine seeing someone struggling and deciding to help. But what if helping them changes your life forever? Would you still do it? Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what kind of story do you want to see next? Drop it in the comments. If you enjoy stories that pull at the heart and linger in your mind, hit subscribe. I've got another one coming tomorrow and, trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now, let's get into today's story. Rain had been falling for hours, drenching the city in a gray, endless haze, turning the sidewalks into slick mirrors reflecting neon lights that flickered and hummed like distant memories. Jasmine pulled her coat tighter around herself, the collar brushing against her jaw, and adjusted her umbrella, though it offered little protection against the wind that seemed determined to chase her home. Her shoes squished in puddles as she walked, the rhythmic tapping of rain against the concrete creating a soundtrack that was both soothing and oddly melancholic. She wasn't in a hurry. Tonight, the city felt different, heavier somehow, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when she saw him. He was crouched on a corner, shoulders hunched, trying desperately to shield himself from the rain with an old tattered jacket that had clearly seen better days. His hair was plastered against his forehead, droplets of water clinging to the tips like tiny reluctant stars. At first, she thought he was just another figure in the blur of the city night, someone she might pass by without a second glance, but then she noticed his eyes. They were startling, dark, alert, and yet holding a depth that seemed to weigh on her chest in a way she couldn't immediately explain. There was a quiet intelligence in them, an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition, and for reasons she didn't understand, she stopped in her tracks. Jasmine adjusted her umbrella again, hesitating as the wind whipped it sideways, snapping her attention back to the man who now seemed curiously aware of her gaze. There was a tension in the air, subtle but undeniable, as if the world itself had paused to watch this exchange. Something about the way he tilted his head, the faint curve of his lips that might have been a smile, or a warning, made her stomach tighten with both intrigue and unease. Most people would have ignored him, would have let the rain wash over his existence without a second thought, but Jasmine felt an odd, almost magnetic pull. Without knowing why, she found herself walking closer. As she approached, a memory she hadn't thought of in years bubbled to the surface, unbidden and vivid. She remembered her grandmother, sitting on the front porch of their old house, knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet afternoon, rain pattering against the roof. Kindness, her grandmother had said, her voice both tender and firm, isn't something you measure. It isn't about expecting anything in return. It's about seeing someone and knowing you have a choice to make, even in the smallest moment. Jasmine had laughed then, the innocence of a 12-year-old shrugging off life's complexities. But tonight, those words hit her differently. They were a compass, pointing her toward a decision she couldn't yet fully comprehend. And so she did the unexpected. She stopped in front of him, letting the rain soak through her coat as if it didn't matter, and held out her hand. Not in judgment, not in pity, but in simple human recognition. "Hey," she said, her voice steady despite the shivering that traveled down her spine. "You can come with me. Just for tonight. You don't have to stay out here alone." There was a pause, an eternity suspended in droplets of rain falling between them, and then he looked up fully. That's when she realized he had been watching her too. The intensity of his gaze caught her off guard, not because it was predatory, but because it was unwavering, almost like he had been waiting for her to make this choice, and somehow, her decision mattered more than she could yet understand. He didn't speak at first, just studied her with a careful deliberation, as if measuring her soul against some invisible scale. There was something unsettling about the quiet between them, a charged moment where the world narrowed down to just the two of them, rain dripping from their eyelashes and coats, the city blurring into insignificance around them. Jasmine felt the pull of something she couldn't name. Curiosity, maybe, or the first stirring of fear mingled with fascination. She didn't yet know his name, or what he wanted, or why her instincts told her to trust him despite every warning flashing in her mind. All she knew was that in this moment, she had made a choice, and some choices, she sensed, have consequences that ripple far beyond the first drop of rain. "You can stay at my place, just for tonight," Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the steady rhythm of rainfall like a fragile promise. She wasn't sure why the words came out so easily, almost as if they had been waiting inside her for years, waiting for someone exactly like him to hear them. He looked at her, and for the briefest fraction of a second, his guarded exterior faltered, revealing something human beneath the layers of mystery. Something raw. Something that made her heart skip in a way she hadn't anticipated. She hadn't planned on doing this. She hadn't planned on bringing a stranger, so soaked, so unknown, into her world. Yet something about him, the curve of his shoulders, the intensity of his gaze, the faint tremor in his voice when he finally spoke, told her that this wasn't just a random encounter. Her gut tightened with hesitation. The city around them seemed to blur, as if the rain had washed away everything except the two of them. Jasmine's mind ran through all the warnings she had been given as a child, all the safety rules her friends recited as if memorized from a manual. Don't talk to strangers. Don't let someone in you don't know. Don't. But then she remembered the look in his eyes, a mixture of vulnerability and quiet desperation, and she realized that all the rules in the world couldn't explain why her instincts told her to step forward. Her grandmother's voice echoed faintly in her memory. Kindness is courage, Jasmine. Sometimes, it's the only brave thing left in the world. And so she stepped forward, opening her umbrella and gesturing toward the street with a nod that felt like an invitation not just to him, but to whatever this night was about to become. He hesitated, the hesitation stretching longer than any ordinary pause, and then slowly, deliberately, he accepted. The way he rose to his feet was graceful in a way that defied the dirt and wetness clinging to his clothes. There was a certain elegance to him, hidden beneath layers of rain-soaked fabric, something that suggested a life entirely unlike the one he pretended to inhabit. Jasmine noticed the careful, measured way he moved, how he adjusted the jacket around his shoulders as if trying to erase every trace of vulnerability. And yet, there was a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips when he followed her, like he had expected her to do this all along. The walk to her apartment was quiet, but charged with an energy that neither of them could name. Every puddle reflected fragments of neon signs above, distorted and fragmented, much like the reality Jasmine felt herself stepping into. She tried to make small talk, light, safe words about the weather, about the absurdity of being caught in a storm, but he responded in short, careful bursts, his voice low, deliberate, almost hypnotic. He asked nothing, revealed nothing, yet the way he listened, the way his eyes darted from her face to her movements, made her feel exposed in a way that was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. When they reached her building, she fumbled with the keys, her hands wet and slightly shaking, but he didn't move to help, not yet. He waited silently, and the patience in his presence made her wonder again who he really was. Once the door clicked open, the warmth from inside met them like a soft embrace. She led him to the couch, grabbed a blanket, and handed it to him without a word. He wrapped himself in it as though it were armor, and for the first time since she had seen him that night, he exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the weight of every street corner he had slept on. She expected him to sleep through the night, curled up quietly, keeping to himself, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed awake, sitting on the edge of the couch, watching her as she moved around the apartment, preparing tea, stacking dishes, trying to make the space feel alive and ordinary. She caught him staring more than once, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her pulse quicken. There was something in his gaze, a quiet insistence, a deep unspoken claim, that suggested this night was far from over, that the story they had stumbled into together was only just beginning. And as the rain tapped against the windows and the city hummed outside, Jasmine realized that this stranger, this man she had invited in on a whim, would not allow himself to be merely a shadow in her life. That night, he would not sleep alone, not just because of the storm outside, but because something in him had already decided that he would not leave her presence, that he would be here in her world, whether she understood it yet or not. The next morning, the city woke sluggishly beneath a sky bruised with gray clouds, the streets still slick with puddles reflecting fragments of a world that seemed entirely ordinary until he spoke. "Do you always make your tea this way?" he asked softly, his voice deliberate, almost melodic, but it wasn't the question itself that caught her, it was the way he said it, as if he were reading between the lines of her gestures, as if he were cataloging every tiny habit she thought was invisible. Jasmine froze for a moment, setting the kettle down, sensing the weight of his attention. He spoke little really, but every word, every tilt of his head, carried the quiet force of curiosity that felt intensely personal. It was unnerving, magnetic, and she couldn't decide if she was drawn to it or afraid of it. As breakfast progressed, his questions continued, subtle, probing, and entirely unexpected. He asked about her childhood, the street she grew up on, what she liked to do when it rained. Every story she offered, light and unguarded, seemed to unlock a thread of insight in him, his reactions measured but revealing, and with each one, Jasmine felt the unsettling sensation that he was mapping a world she had never meant to expose. He didn't pry aggressively, but he listened with the precision of someone who was memorizing not just facts, but patterns, rhythms, the intimate cadences of her life. She tried to keep the conversation casual, joking about old neighbors, remembering her first bike ride in the cracked streets near her school, but every laugh she offered seemed to draw him deeper into her orbit, as if he were noting exactly how she moved through the world. Jasmine remembered suddenly, a memory she had buried for years, a flashback to when she was 8, walking with her mother through a wealthy part of town she rarely visited, the air smelling faintly of money and possibility. She had watched children with perfect hair and crisp uniforms, riding bicycles that gleamed in the sunlight, and she remembered feeling both awe and a tiny stab of longing. That memory had always been distant, a faint echo of privilege she had never really belonged to, yet as she glanced at him now, something in the way he observed her reminded her of that old fascination, the feeling that some people carried worlds within them that she might never touch, unless somehow they decided to let her in. And then, just as she was letting herself settle into the uneasy rhythm of morning, She noticed it. He knew details about her neighborhood, tiny facts she had never spoken aloud, corners of the streets she walked alone, the names of little shops she barely remembered. It wasn't enough to be coincidence. It was too precise, too deliberate. The way he mentioned the cafe where she had first tasted hot chocolate in winter, or the narrow alley where she sometimes cut through to avoid the noise of the main street, it sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't just curious, he was informed. And the revelation hit her slowly, like a shadow creeping along the wall. Someone had been watching more than her actions. They had been studying the world she thought she owned. She tried to push the thought away, laughed softly, and said, "You know, that's strangely accurate. How would you even know that?" But he simply smiled, an unreadable curve of lips that suggested both amusement and quiet confidence. He offered no explanation, only his presence, the intensity of his gaze holding her attention longer than was comfortable, and maybe that was the point, to keep her wondering, to make her aware of how little she truly knew about the man sitting quietly across from her. Jasmine paused and almost instinctively turned toward the audience, as if sharing a secret she couldn't speak aloud. If you were in her shoes, would you have noticed the signs as quickly as she did? Comment below. I want to know if you think she's in over her head or exactly where she's meant to be. The morning stretched on, quiet but loaded with subtle tension. Every glance he cast, every measured word, hinted at a life that felt entirely inaccessible, yet tantalizingly close, and with each small revelation, Jasmine realized that the man she had invited in on a whim was not only different from anyone she had ever met. He was something else entirely, someone whose presence could shift the boundaries of her world without a single overt gesture. And even as she tried to ignore it, a tiny nagging awareness settled into her chest. The city outside was no longer ordinary, and the stranger on her couch was no longer simply a man in need. He was a force quietly claiming space in her life, and she could feel the trajectory of that claim unfolding, one deliberate, unervingly precise detail at a time. Morning arrived in a muted haze, the sunlight slanting through the blinds in pale streaks that painted lines across the hardwood floor, cutting across the room like whispers of clarity Jasmine wasn't ready for. As she moved to the kitchen to pour herself a second cup of coffee, her eyes caught something on his wrist, a glint of metal that had gone unnoticed in the dim light of yesterday's storm. It was a watch, elegant, bold, impossibly refined, the kind she had only ever glimpsed in high-end advertisements or on the wrists of people whose lives were entirely separate from her own. She blinked, thinking perhaps it was just a trick of the light, but as he adjusted his sleeve casually, the watch gleamed again, sharp and undeniable, a subtle declaration of status that contradicted everything she thought she knew about him. Her pulse quickened, curiosity mixing with unease. The brand, the design, even the weight on his wrist. It screamed wealth, though he carried it with the understated confidence of someone for whom luxury was invisible, effortless. It wasn't ostentation, it was identity. Jasmine's mind raced, trying to reconcile this simple, elegant accessory with a man she had invited in from the rain, the man who had seemed vulnerable, cautious, ordinary. There was a dissonance here, a quiet tension that made the air in her apartment feel suddenly thinner, charged with an invisible electricity. How could someone survive nights on the street yet wear a watch that cost more than her rent? She caught herself staring, an instinctive mix of fascination and caution tightening her chest. "Where did you get that?" she asked casually, trying to sound lighthearted, but her voice betrayed a flicker of the alarm dancing just beneath her words. He glanced down at it, his expression easy, unbothered, the faintest smile brushing his lips. "Oh, this," he said, his tone airy, almost dismissive. "Just something I picked up while passing through." The words were casual, but they hung in the room like smoke, twisting and curling around her thoughts. Passing through. That was it. Nothing more. No explanation, no context, no attempt to align with her assumptions of reality. And yet, something in the way he spoke suggested that the phrase carried more weight than he was letting on, that it was both literal and deliberate misdirection, a small breadcrumb meant to confuse and intrigue all at once. Jasmine's heart skipped. She had already noticed the hints, the uncanny knowledge of her streets, the subtle elegance in his movements. But this felt like a carefully placed clue in a game she hadn't realized she was playing. As he sipped his coffee, casually scrolling on his phone, Jasmine couldn't shake the sense that the apartment, her space, had somehow become a stage, and she was both actor and audience in a drama that had been quietly building long before her arrival. Each small gesture, each glance he offered, seemed curated, deliberate, impossible to fully decipher. She reminded herself to breathe, to let it unfold naturally, but every instinct in her body screamed that this man was not what he seemed. There was danger here, yes, but also a pull, an intrigue, a gravity that threatened to bend her usual boundaries into something unrecognizable. She tried to focus on mundane details, the rising steam of her coffee, the distant hum of the city waking up, but her mind kept returning to the watch, to the weight it implied, to the story it silently told. Who was he, really? And why had he come to her corner of the world at all? The contradiction of his presence, the mix of vulnerability and hidden affluence, teased her thoughts relentlessly. She knew she should ask more, probe carefully, but the words caught in her throat, as if saying them aloud might shift the fragile equilibrium that had settled between them overnight. Jasmine glanced toward the audience, a playful conspiratorial tilt in her expression if they could see her. The morning stretched on, filled with a quiet tension of unspoken truths, and Jasmine realized that nothing in her world would ever feel ordinary again. A man who appeared homeless, who had claimed nothing, had already rewritten the rules of her reality simply by existing in her space, leaving her to wonder how much of him was real, how much carefully constructed, and what exactly it meant that she was beginning to care about both possibilities at once. By mid-morning, the apartment had settled into a fragile rhythm, the storm outside long gone, leaving streets glistening and smells of wet asphalt lingering in the air. Jasmine was in the middle of folding laundry when a soft thump echoed through the hall, another delivery. She paused, frowning, because she hadn't ordered anything recently. Shrugging it off, she walked to the door and opened it, only to find a small package sitting there with no note, the return address unrecognizable. Curiosity prickled her skin as she picked it up, turning it over in her hands, until her eyes landed on the name written in elegant, precise handwriting. It wasn't her name. It was his, Alexander Montgomery. Her eyebrows shot up. The name was familiar from the snippets of conversation they had shared, and yet seeing it written like this, on a package delivered to her door, stirred something deeper, something unsettling in her chest. She called out softly, "Alexander, did you order this?" His reply was casual, effortless, brushing off the question like it carried no weight. "Probably. Don't worry about it." But the way he said it, nonchalant, yet undeniably present, sent a flicker of doubt across her mind. Something wasn't right. And then it happened again. Later that afternoon, while Jasmine was preparing lunch, a soft ring echoed from the intercom, signaling another delivery. Same scenario. Same name. Alexander Montgomery. Not once, not twice, but a small chain of parcels that began to accumulate at her threshold, each one neatly wrapped, each one addressed to him, as if the city itself were conspiring to remind her that this man was not ordinary, that he carried a presence beyond the streets she thought she knew. Her pulse quickened as she stacked them on the counter, the neat handwriting staring at her like a silent declaration. He existed in layers she hadn't yet begun to understand. She looked at him then, half expecting him to seem embarrassed or flustered, but instead, Alexander just laughed, a soft, low sound that resonated in the apartment. It was not arrogance, not mockery, but the kind of laugh that suggested amusement at the simplicity of her concern, as if he were aware of the strangeness of the world and found it amusing rather than threatening. "It's nothing," he said, shrugging, his tone casual, like he was brushing away dust. And that was the thing. He had a way of minimizing extraordinary circumstances, of framing the impossible as ordinary. Jasmine frowned, feeling the tug of unease in her chest. How could someone casually ignore a trail of evidence that would make anyone else stop in their tracks and question every assumption? Her mind wandered to the moments from the previous day, the uncanny knowledge of her neighborhood, the elegant watch, the deliberate control of conversation. This wasn't someone who just happened to be in her life. He was shaping it, threading himself through her routines with the precision of a sculptor, and all the while keeping the veneer of casual indifference. She felt the tug of both fascination and alarm, the push and pull that left her heart racing even as her rational mind whispered warnings. Jasmine turned toward the camera, or rather imagined speaking directly to anyone who might understand this creeping tension, and asked softly, "If someone in your home started receiving things for a name that wasn't yours, but it belonged to a person you barely knew, would you be cautious, or would you trust their word that it's nothing? Comment below, I want to know, what would you do?" The evening approached, and the parcels had created a quiet presence in the apartment, stacking in neat corners, reminders that Alexander's life was larger, more deliberate, and far more complex than she had first imagined. And as he sat across from her, sipping tea with effortless calm, she realized that the man she had invited in out of simple kindness was quietly orchestrating a presence in her world, threading mystery and influence into the very spaces she considered safe. She didn't know how far it would go, but for the first time, she felt the undeniable shift. Nothing about this man or this night was ordinary, and she was standing at the edge of a story that was just beginning to unfold. Dinner that evening was quiet, not the kind of forced small talk that fills awkward silences, but a rhythm that felt almost intimate. Jasmine had set the table simply, a soft candle flickering in the center, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. Alexander sat across from her, his posture casual, yet every gesture measured, deliberate, as though he were both present and simultaneously observing something far beyond the room. He started talking about himself, not in the boastful performative way that some people do, but in fragments, small windows into a past that was carefully curated, each piece revealing just enough to draw her closer without ever giving her the full picture. He spoke of streets she'd never walked, of cities she'd only read about in magazines, and of moments that felt intimate yet impossibly distant. His stories had gaps, pauses where a name should have been, a place, a detail, leaving her to fill in the spaces with imagination. Each silence felt like a test, a quiet measure of how much trust she would extend, how much curiosity she would allow to overtake caution. It was intoxicating. And even as her logical mind whispered that caution was warranted, that she was threading herself into someone whose intention she barely understood, she found herself leaning in, asking follow-up questions, wanting more, needing to see the truth behind the careful mask. It was remarkable, really, how easily vulnerability could disarm a person. Psychologists talk about it. The human brain is hardwired to trust those who reveal themselves, even partially, because it triggers empathy, connection, the subtle instinct that we are meant to reciprocate openness. Alexander had mastered this without effort, a natural fluidity that made her guard slip almost without her realizing it. She caught herself laughing at a story about his childhood, vivid, almost cinematic in detail, though she knew nothing could be taken at face value. And yet, that laughter bridged a gap she hadn't noticed was there, making the apartment feel smaller, warmer, like a bubble removed from the storm of the city outside. He mentioned a night he had spent stranded in a foreign city, the lights of skyscrapers bleeding into fog, people rushing past as if he didn't exist, and the way he described it, lonely, observant, almost detached, made her heart tighten. Something about the quiet precision with which he recounted moments of struggle, paired with the ease of his current presence, was disarming. It didn't feel manipulative, it felt magnetic. And she noticed slowly that the more he shared, the more she found herself letting down walls she hadn't intended to dismantle. Jasmine paused, looking up at him, and imagined the audience leaning in with her, silently asking themselves. As the evening wore on, the soft hum of the city outside faded into the background, leaving only the warmth of candlelight and the delicate cadence of their voices. She realized in a subtle, almost alarming way, that she was drawn to him despite every instinct telling her to be cautious, despite the nagging whisper that she knew nothing about who he really was. His presence was magnetic, his stories tantalizingly incomplete, and each carefully measured confession pulled her deeper into a world she wasn't prepared for but couldn't resist exploring. She didn't know yet what lay ahead, only that the man she had brought into her life by a chance act of kindness had already begun shaping her world, and she wasn't entirely sure whether to be afraid, exhilarated, or both at once. Jasmine paused mid-sentence, caught off guard by the intensity in his eyes. Alexander wasn't staring at her in the ordinary sense. He was looking through her, as if peeling away the layers she didn't even know she was hiding. There was a sharpness to his gaze, a quiet patience, almost predatory in its precision, but it wasn't threatening. It was unervingly intimate, the kind of attention that could make someone feel simultaneously exposed and understood. Her skin prickled, her heartbeat thrumming in her ears as though the room itself had contracted, compressing the distance between them into something electric, almost unbearable. She tried to focus on the mundane, pouring water, arranging the silverware, adjusting the flickering candle, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying her own awareness of the tension that had slipped quietly between them. Every subtle movement he made, every tilt of his head or slight curl of his lips, seemed calibrated to pull her attention, to measure her response. It was hypnotic. She knew the rational voice inside her head was screaming warnings. He was a stranger, and she had no idea what he was capable of, but somehow the warmth of his gaze, the quiet gravity in his presence, made those warnings sound distant, like echoes of a world she no longer fully inhabited. Alexander leaned back casually, one hand resting on the table, and allowed a soft, almost imperceptible smile to tug at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't smugness. It wasn't arrogance. It was simply the acknowledgement of power, not the loud, showy kind, but the quiet, irresistible kind that made people want to lean in, to listen, to be seen in return. Jasmine felt a magnetic pull immediately, a strange recognition that her focus had shifted from merely observing him to wanting his attention, wanting him to notice the subtle ways she moved, the minute details she had always kept tucked away. She blinked and caught herself wondering if he could see that shift, if he had orchestrated it, or if it was simply the way humans responded when someone truly saw them. Her mind flashed briefly to moments of vulnerability she had shared earlier, fragments of childhood, the unpolished truths she had confessed during dinner, and she realized something unnerving. Each confession had deepened the connection, had drawn her closer to him in a way that wasn't entirely rational. Humans are hardwired to respond to vulnerability with empathy, sometimes attraction, and Alexander seemed to understand this instinctively, using it to navigate the space between them without uttering a single manipulative word. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet deeply effective. Jasmine's pulse quickened, and she imagined herself speaking to the audience, leaning in conspiratorially. Have you ever felt that pull? The kind where someone's gaze makes you question why you ever thought you were in control. Comment below, would you lean in, or would you step back before it gets too close? She shook her head softly, trying to dispel the intensity of the moment, yet she couldn't ignore the shift within herself. The desire for his attention, for the quiet acknowledgement of her presence, was undeniable. She wanted it, as much as she feared it. And in that silent exchange, the room seemed to shrink further, leaving only the two of them and the charged space between them. Every word she had spoken earlier, every small gesture, every careful smile, now felt like it had been building toward this moment, a moment of unspoken recognition, of shared understanding that neither of them yet fully named. For the first time since the rain-soaked night that had brought him into her life, Jasmine understood the dangerous allure of someone who sees you completely and effortlessly, someone who can unsettle and comfort at the same time. And as the candle flickered, casting shadows across the walls, she realized, with a shiver she couldn't hide, that she wanted to be seen like this, that she wanted to be part of the gravity he carried with him, and that this desire might be far more consequential than she could yet comprehend. Later that night, as Jasmine scrolled through her phone, a notification caught her attention. It was a text from her best friend, Latoya, blinking urgently on the screen. Be careful who you let in your life. Not everyone is what they seem. She laughed softly, the sound light and dismissive, thinking of Alexander's calm, composed demeanor, the quiet way he had carried himself all day. Latoya always leaned toward caution, imagining danger in every shadow, but Jasmine had convinced herself that he was different. He was charming, yes, mysterious, yes, but harmless, or at least she hoped so. She tucked her phone down, shaking her head at the prudence she had set aside, telling herself her instincts were enough to navigate the night. But then, as she sipped her tea and glanced up, she caught a movement that made her stomach drop. Alexander was holding her phone, casually scrolling through her messages, eyes calm but intent, reading her conversations as if they were a map of her life. Her hand froze halfway to her mouth. The casual ease in which he operated made the act feel almost like a performance, a subtle assertion of control that she hadn't anticipated. He looked up and met her eyes, and for a moment there was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement. He knew more than she thought he should, and yet, he didn't need to justify himself. A ripple of unease traveled down her spine. The warning in Latoya's text, once easy to dismiss, now pressed against her consciousness with sudden clarity. Was it care, or had she simply misread the signals? The act of reading her texts, no matter how benign it seemed, carried the weight of intrusion, a subtle reminder that the man she had invited in could shape her world without her consent. And even as she processed this, a twisted thrill mingled with the fear, a dangerous cocktail that made her heart pound faster, as if part of her craved the tension. Humans are wired to respond to attention, even when it comes with unease, and Jasmine felt that pull in a way that made her both terrified and inexplicably drawn to him. Her thoughts raced. Was this curiosity, obsession, or something darker? She felt herself questioning every small detail from the past 2 days, the uncanny knowledge of her neighborhood, the watch, the casual but deliberate confessions, the magnetic pull of his gaze. It wasn't just attraction anymore. There was a complexity here that unsettled her, a sense of subtle threat hidden behind elegance and charm. She could no longer comfortably dismiss her friend's warning, and yet, she couldn't look away either. She paused and imagined speaking directly to the audience. As the evening stretched on, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. Alexander returned her phone without a word, placing it gently on the table as if nothing had happened, yet the unspoken tension lingered like smoke in the corners of the room. Jasmine sat there, heart racing, acutely aware of the thin line between fascination and danger. And then, just as she exhaled, a subtle sound reached her, a soft knock at the door, almost imperceptible, followed by a second knock that seemed closer, more deliberate, as if the night itself had leaned forward to test her. Her pulse quickened, and she realized, with a quiet sense of dread, that the threat wasn't just in Alexander's subtle actions. It was in the way he had reshaped her sense of safety, making the ordinary unpredictable. And as the city hummed outside, the shadows in the apartment seemed deeper, heavier, reminding her that some doors, once opened, might never close fully. If this shocked you already, just wait for the ending. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The following morning, the city stretched awake under a soft, pale sun that barely pierced the lingering haze of dawn. Jasmine was tidying up the small kitchen when the hum of a luxury car idling outside caught her attention. Curious, she moved closer to the window and saw Alexander stepping out, dressed neatly in a tailored suit, a presence that radiated quiet authority. Moments later, a sleek black vehicle rolled to a stop at the curb, and a driver in impeccable uniform opened the door. Alexander nodded briefly and slipped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft, decisive click. Jasmine's brow furrowed. He had mentioned going to work, but she had never asked much about what he did, nor did she think she'd need to. She had assumed, based on the scraps of his confessions and the careful mystique he maintained, that his life was complicated but ordinary enough to not involve anything so formal. She watched the car glide away, and a subtle creeping unease began to settle over her. Something didn't add up. Alexander didn't drive himself, and she couldn't shake the fact that she had never seen him mention needing a driver, or having an assistant, or any of the hallmarks of someone who required such an entourage. It was the little details, the way the driver's uniform was spotless, the car polished to an impossible sheen, the quiet coordination of the scene, that gnawed at her. She felt the familiar twist of suspicion curling in her chest, a sensation that had grown steadily over the past few days. Every anecdote, every carefully dropped fragment of his life, now seemed to demand a second look. There was a precision to his presence, a choreography that hadn't existed in a man she had initially taken at face value. It was almost cinematic, the way the luxury car disappeared into the distance, leaving her standing at the window with her heart hammering and 1,000 questions buzzing in her mind. Her thoughts raced. If he didn't drive himself, if he had access to resources like this, what else had he concealed? The pieces of the puzzle she had been noticing, the watch, the uncanny familiarity with her neighborhood, the casual charm, the magnetic control over her attention, all pointed to a reality far beyond the passing-through story he had offered. And suddenly, she understood that Alexander had been calibrating the truth in precise increments, letting her see just enough to trust, to lean in, to feel safe, while withholding what mattered most. Jasmine sank onto the couch, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee mug. The realization hit her with quiet force. She had been interacting with a man whose life was extraordinary, whose influence stretched far beyond her own modest world, and she had accepted him into her apartment without questioning the full extent of who he truly was. Her mind flicked back to LaToya's warning, to the text she had laughed off, and she felt the sharp, bitter clarity of hindsight. She turned, imagining speaking directly to the audience. By the time the evening came, Alexander returned. He entered the apartment with the same casual elegance, carrying nothing, his presence alone enough to fill the space. Jasmine noticed the faint smile that lingered on his lips, the effortless confidence that seemed to radiate from every gesture, and she realized the truth. He hadn't lied in a simple sense. He had performed a story, curated it, and left gaps wide enough for her imagination to roam. He wasn't merely passing through. That much was clear. And while the full scope of his identity remained a mystery, she now understood that his world, far beyond the rain-soaked streets she had known, was beginning to eclipse her own, pulling her toward a reality she hadn't been prepared to enter. He started appearing at places she visited, unnoticed at first. The local coffee shop, the corner bookstore, even the Saturday farmer's market where she liked to browse alone. At first, she told herself it was chance, that they simply shared similar routines. After all, people crossed paths in the same neighborhood all the time. But then, the coincidences began to pile up, each one sharper, stranger, harder to explain away. She laughed about it with a friend once. "It's almost like he's following me," she joked, her tone light but her stomach unsettled. The friend chuckled and brushed it off, telling her not to overthink. And for a while, she believed it too. Coincidences. Nothing more. Until the day he showed up at a yoga studio across town, one she had never mentioned to him, not once. That was when the laughter stopped feeling real. Suddenly, his presence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. He didn't approach her directly, not always. Sometimes he just lingered, sitting at the back of a cafe or on the far bench of the park, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made the air feel heavy. She would try to convince herself it was paranoia, but deep down she knew. His presence wasn't casual. It was deliberate. That's when the line between attention and surveillance blurred. Every time she stepped outside, she found herself scanning the crowd, searching for his face before she could even relax into the moment. Even in her own home, the thought nagged at her, was he outside right now? Watching? Waiting? An expert once said, attention is the first step toward influence. She remembered reading that line in a book long ago, and now it echoed in her mind like a warning. Because his attention wasn't fleeting, it was calculated. It wasn't a compliment, it was control. Still, there was a dangerous part of her that resisted the truth. Because sometimes, when she caught his eyes across the street or felt the weight of his gaze in a crowded place, she couldn't ignore the spark of something else. Something terrifying. Something she didn't want to name. Was it flattery? Fear? Or both tangled together so tightly she couldn't tell the difference anymore? And that's what made it so insidious. He didn't need to touch her, didn't need to speak a word, to plant himself into her thoughts. His shadow became a constant companion, whispering in the background of her life, pushing her to question every choice. Did she pick that cafe because she wanted to, or because he'd be there? Did she wear that dress for herself, or because he might notice? She started feeling as if her freedom wasn't entirely her own anymore. Every decision, every step, was touched by his unseen presence. It was like being trapped in a game she never agreed to play. And worse, some small fragile part of her couldn't deny the twisted comfort of it. To be seen so completely. To be noticed, relentlessly. To matter to someone to the point of obsession. But she also knew this wasn't love. It was something far darker. Something that didn't just want her attention, but her submission. Tell me, what would you do if someone started showing up everywhere you went? Would you brush it off as coincidence, or would you see it as the warning it really is? He bought tickets to events she had mentioned once. Offhand comments slipped into casual conversation, things she barely remembered saying. A poetry reading downtown. A photography exhibit that had piqued her interest. Even a charity gala she thought about attending but never invited him to. And yet, there he was, showing up as if it were all perfectly natural. At first, she wanted to believe it was sweet. Maybe he was just attentive, someone who remembered details most people forgot. But soon it became clear, this wasn't memory. This was strategy. Coincidence? Impossible. The timing, the precision, the way he positioned himself to always appear within reach. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. He wanted to be everywhere she was. To weave himself into the fabric of her life so tightly that she couldn't untangle herself without unraveling completely. Every new encounter felt like a test, a silent push against her boundaries. When she mentioned how crowded she expected the gala to be, he smiled and said, "Then it'll be easier for us to disappear into the crowd together." When she brought up the poetry reading, he leaned closer, his voice low. "I thought words meant more when someone else understood them with you." It should have felt romantic, maybe even flattering. But instead, it gnawed at her. Because beneath the tenderness, there was something invasive. It wasn't just that he showed up, it was that he expected her to accept it without question. To see his presence as natural, inevitable. She began testing him back, throwing out false leads just to see what he would do. Mentioning places she never intended to visit. Casual remarks about events in other parts of the city. And each time she waited, watching closely. Sometimes he followed the trail. Sometimes he didn't. But the fact that he ever did proved everything. He was listening, recording, tracing her every word like breadcrumbs on a path only he was meant to follow. And that's when she realized, it wasn't about affection. It was about control. The boundaries she thought were hers alone to set were now being tested, pushed, bent. Little by little, his grip tightened, not with force, but with presence. Not with threats, but with inevitability. It was terrifying how subtle it was. If she tried to explain it to someone else, it might sound harmless. So what? He bought tickets. He remembered what you said. Isn't that just caring? But she knew the truth. This wasn't care. This was intrusion disguised as devotion. And yet, part of her felt complicit. Because every time he appeared, part of her played along. She smiled, she engaged. She even allowed herself to be pulled into his orbit. Why? Because it was easier than confrontation. Easier than shattering the illusion. Easier than facing the reality that she was no longer fully in control. She wondered how many others had been caught in that same web, mistaking persistence for passion, intrusion for intimacy. Alone, she cried, but not just from fear. The tears that streaked her face were messy, tangled with emotions that didn't fit neatly into one box. She was scared, yes, but underneath that fear was something darker, something more complicated. She felt flattered, important, desired in a way she had never experienced before. It was intoxicating, this constant attention, this sense that every step she took mattered to someone. The way he remembered details, the way he appeared without being asked, the way his eyes followed her as if she were the only thing in the room, it all made her feel larger than life, like she carried some secret power. And yet, buried beneath the surface of that flattery was a weight pressing against her chest. Because with every gesture, every calculated appearance, she lost something precious, her freedom. She began to see the bars forming around her, invisible yet suffocating. When she wanted to slip out alone, she found him waiting. When she longed for solitude, his presence filled the silence. She started censoring herself, what she said, where she went, who she met, because she knew he was listening, watching, collecting. It was as if he had rewritten the script of her life, inserting himself into every scene. And still, she didn't know how to name it. Was this obsession? Was this love pushed to its limits? Or was this the beginning of something far more dangerous, a grip that would one day choke the air from her lungs? Desire mixed with dread, and the cocktail left her dizzy, uncertain of her own instincts. At night, she lay awake replaying every interaction, searching for clues. The laughter that sounded genuine, the confessions that felt raw, the promises whispered like secrets. Were they real? Or were they tools, sharpened to pierce her walls and claim territory she hadn't agreed to surrender? Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Attention isn't always affection. Sometimes it's a chain disguised as a ribbon. That memory sent chills down her spine. She wanted to believe he cared, that he saw her in ways no one else ever had. But when she looked closer, she realized he wasn't just seeing her, he was consuming her. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to push him away. Part of her feared what would happen if she did. Another part feared what would happen if she didn't. The tension stretched tight inside her, every choice heavy with consequence. It was in those quiet moments, when she sat with herself, that the contradictions tore her apart. She craved his attention while dreading it. She wanted his eyes on her even as she wished for escape. Love and fear danced so closely together she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Have you ever felt that pull, when someone's devotion makes you feel both powerful and powerless at the same time? When affection feels like both a gift and a trap? Because that's where she was now, caught in a storm of emotions, unable to tell if she was standing at the edge of something beautiful, or on the brink of something that could destroy her. He finally revealed the truth. He owned half the city. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and impossible to ignore. For a moment, she thought he was joking, another one of his evasive half-truths. But when he leaned back in the chair, eyes steady, voice calm, she knew this wasn't a game. This was a confession, and it changed everything. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't deny the shock that spread through her body, a chill that made her hands tremble against the glass she held. She replayed every memory, every fragment of conversation, every glance at his watch, his clothes, the driver waiting at the curb. It all fit now, a puzzle clicking into place with terrifying precision. He wasn't some drifter. He wasn't passing through. He was power, real, tangible, dangerous power. And yet, that wasn't what unsettled her the most. What froze her blood was the way he looked at her when he said it, as if none of the wealth, none of the influence, none of the hidden empire mattered. He wanted her, not the world. His eyes burned with it, a need sharper than any ambition. She searched his face, desperate for cracks, some sign that this was exaggeration, or worse, manipulation. But there was no tremor in his voice, no twitch in his hands. He believed it. He was telling her his truth. And in that truth was a weight heavier than she had ever imagined. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in with each second of silence. She thought about the deliveries, the appearances, the subtle ways he had tested her. Now she understood, it wasn't obsession without reason. It was a man used to possession, to control, to bending the world to his will. And somehow, she had become part of that will. He leaned forward then, closing the space between them, his voice dropping into a near whisper. Everything I've built, everything I've hidden, it means nothing if I don't have you. It should have sounded romantic, maybe even noble. But all she heard was possession disguised as devotion. Her pulse quickened, not with excitement, but with fear tangled in something she couldn't admit. Part of her was captivated. To be chosen by someone who could have anything. Wasn't that what so many people longed for? To matter so much to someone so untouchable? And yet, beneath the allure, the dread only deepened. She forced a smile, her lips trembling as she tried to hide the war raging inside her. Every instinct screamed to ask the questions clawing at her chest. Why her? Why now? What did he see in her that made him abandon a world of power for one woman? But the words stuck in her throat, because she already feared the answers. And as he reached for her hand, the weight of his touch felt like a promise and a threat all at once. Could she trust someone who could control her life? The question echoed in her chest louder than his confession. A billionaire CEO, a man who owned half the city, sitting in her small worn-down kitchen, looking at her as though she was the only thing that mattered in his empire. It should have felt like a fairy tale, like the stories her grandmother once told her before bed. But instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong step, and she'd lose herself completely. Everything she knew about kindness and power collided inside her. She had grown up believing in generosity, in giving without expecting anything back, in choosing humanity over greed. That was who she was, the girl who stopped for strangers in the rain, the girl who took risks on trust. But now, staring at Malcolm, the man she had brought into her home, she realized this wasn't just about kindness anymore. This was about surrender. This was about what happens when the lines blur between protection and possession. He leaned forward again, his voice calm, almost pleading. Amara, I don't want to own you. I want to love you. Don't confuse my world with my heart. But wasn't it the same thing? She wondered. Could someone like him even separate the two? Power and love. Influence and intimacy. How could he know where one ended and the other began when his entire life was built on controlling outcomes, on bending people and situations to his will? And yet, she wanted to trust him. That was the twist tearing her apart. She remembered the way he had looked that first night, drenched and trembling, his eyes carrying more sorrow than secrets. That vulnerability had been real, she was sure of it. The way he listened when she spoke, the way he noticed things no one else ever did, that wasn't fake. It couldn't be. Could it? Her hands tightened around her glass, knuckles white, as she felt the heat of his gaze. She thought of her grandmother's voice again, soft and steady. Kindness doesn't mean blindness, child. Sometimes the wolf wears the wool until the door is closed. Was that what this was? A wolf in silk clothing, waiting for the moment she let her guard down? Or was it something rarer, a man who finally saw her, really saw her, beyond the small apartment, beyond the neighborhood, beyond the barriers of class and money? The dilemma gnawed at her, ripping her into two halves, one desperate to escape, the other desperate to stay. Trust was a dangerous currency, and she had already given too much. But in the quiet between his words, she heard her own heartbeat whispering, what if he means it? What if this is the moment your life changes forever? She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to break the silence. "If I trust you, Malcolm, if I let you in completely, you can't ever take that back from me." He didn't hesitate. His answer came like thunder, deep and certain. "I don't want to take anything from you. I want to give you everything." And in that moment, she couldn't tell if he had just handed her the key to a new world, or shackled her with invisible chains she'd never be able to escape. Their connection became undeniable. It was as if the air between them had thickened, pulling them closer no matter how hard her rational mind screamed for distance. Amara couldn't ignore it anymore. The way her pulse raced when Malcolm's eyes found hers, the way her body betrayed her fear by leaning toward him instead of away. The tension had transformed into something far more dangerous than curiosity. It had become attraction. Every touch, every glance was charged with risk. When he brushed his hand against hers, sparks shot through her like electricity, not just because of desire, but because of everything that came attached to him. His world, his secrets, his power. His presence was intoxicating, and she hated how much she craved it. A man like Malcolm wasn't supposed to fit into her story, wasn't supposed to sit at her table, walk her streets, learn her routines. But he had, and now she found herself standing in a space between fear and longing, unable to step fully into either. But love under obsession is never simple. That was the truth creeping in like a shadow, no matter how bright the moments between them felt. She couldn't deny how good it felt when he opened up, when he revealed cracks in his armor. Yet, even in his most vulnerable moments, there was still an intensity that scared her. His love wasn't gentle, it was consuming. It wasn't just an offering, it was a demand. And in her quieter moments, when she was alone in bed, staring at the ceiling, she asked herself the question she was afraid to voice. Was she falling in love, or being pulled into something she couldn't escape? One night, as the city lights flickered outside her window, Malcolm reached for her hand, holding it as though it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His voice was soft, stripped of all the confidence she had come to know. "Amara, do you feel it too? Or am I the only one drowning in this?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, to remind him that they were from different worlds and this was nothing more than a strange collision of fate. But the truth burned too hot to suppress. "I feel it," she whispered. The words tasted like surrender. And in that moment, it was as if the room itself exhaled. The tension between them snapped, replaced with something heavier, more binding. It wasn't just acknowledgement, it was a vow, spoken in silence. Still, as he kissed her hand, lingering as though he was sealing a promise, a sharp unease coiled in her stomach. She thought back to every warning, every subtle sign that his affection had sharper edges than she wanted to admit. Because desire doesn't erase danger, and intimacy doesn't erase obsession. If anything, it made it harder to see the difference. Now she was entangled body and soul, with a man who could shift her world with a single decision. And though her heart fluttered under the weight of connection, her mind whispered the question she was too afraid to ask. When love feels this powerful, is it truly love, or is it the beginning of control disguised as devotion? What do you think? Can love born out of obsession ever turn into something real, or is it doomed from the very beginning? He left, saying only, "Decide wisely." The words echoed in the apartment long after the door clicked shut, hanging like smoke in the silence he left behind. Amara stood frozen, her arms wrapped around herself as though she could shield her heart from the weight of those two words. Decide wisely. It wasn't just advice, it was a warning, a command, and a plea all tangled together. She realized her choice could redefine her future. This wasn't just about opening her home to a stranger anymore, or even choosing to trust a man whose life was painted in shadows. No, this was about who she would become if she chose him. Would she still be Amara, the girl who believed kindness could change the world, or would she be reshaped into someone molded by his wealth, his influence, his obsession? And then came the twist she couldn't escape. Was it freedom, or surrender? Could she really call it freedom if she stepped into a world where every door he opened had already been unlocked by him, every opportunity handed down like a gift wrapped in golden chains? Or would refusing him be its own kind of prison, haunted by the what-ifs of walking away from a man who could have given her everything? She sat by the window that night, watching raindrops trace crooked lines down the glass, each one a reflection of the storm unraveling inside her. For every reason to run, she found another reason to stay. His eyes, his vulnerability, the way he saw her not as a woman to be pitied, but as someone worthy of admiration, that couldn't be faked. And yet, the surveillance, the lies, the control, those couldn't be ignored either. Her grandmother's voice came back again, like a thread woven through every moment of her life. Decisions define you, not the promises others make. Don't let someone else's truth erase your own. It was a guiding light, but even wisdom couldn't erase the pull she felt toward him. Because the truth was simple and terrifying. She wanted him, even if wanting him meant stepping into the unknown. The city outside seemed alive, as though it too was waiting for her answer. Cars passed, horns blared, but in her apartment, there was only silence. She imagined Malcolm somewhere across town, pacing a penthouse floor, waiting for her decision like a king awaiting the judgment of a queen. The thought almost made her laugh. What kind of power did she hold in this dynamic? But then she realized, maybe more than she thought. Because he had everything, yet he was still waiting for her. That was the real test. Did she see it as devotion, or as manipulation? Was his waiting proof of respect for her choice, or another layer of control, forcing her to bear the burden of a decision that would inevitably bind her to him either way? She leaned back, closing her eyes, the weight of the dilemma pressing into her chest like a stone. Tomorrow would come, and with it, Malcolm. And with him, the life-altering question of whether her future would be defined by her freedom, or her surrender. If this left you uneasy, you're not alone. Because the truth is, stories like Amara's aren't just fiction, they're mirrors. They remind us of how fragile trust can be, how quickly kindness can spiral into something we don't recognize. Amara thought she was simply helping a stranger on a rainy night, but what she uncovered was a man with the power to shape her world in ways she never asked for. And now she stood at the crossroads of freedom and surrender, heart torn between the intoxicating pull of love and the suffocating grip of obsession. Sometimes, the kindest act can change everything, and yet, danger always follows. That's the paradox of humanity, isn't it? We open doors with our hearts, hoping for connection, but every door also carries the risk of letting in someone who doesn't just step into your home, but into your life, your choices, your very sense of self. For Amara, the choice isn't just about love, it's about survival of her identity. And maybe that's why this story lingers, long after the last word. Because it forces us to face the question we'd rather ignore. How much of ourselves are we willing to give to someone else in the name of love? At what point does devotion become control, and at what point does longing become a cage? Malcolm's truth was staggering. He had wealth, he had power, he had the city at his feet. But what shook Amara, and maybe what shakes you too, was that in the end, he wanted her more than all of it. That sounds romantic, doesn't it? But if you look closer, isn't it also terrifying? Because what happens when someone with everything to lose decides that you are the only thing worth fighting for? She sat with her choice, the weight pressing heavier than anything she had ever carried. And though you may not be in her shoes, the lesson is universal. Never forget the cost of your freedom, even when love tempts you to trade it away. So let me turn it back to you one last time. Do you believe love can survive when it's built on obsession? Or is obsession the poison that makes love impossible? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I want to hear how you see it. Remember, fairy tales aren't always sweet, and the kindest act can change everything. But sometimes, behind every gesture of love, there's a shadow you never saw coming. And that's the truth Amara now lives with. Will it destroy her, or redefine her? That's a story still being written. What do you think? Would you risk it all, or walk away before it's too late?
Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story moved you, the next one will hit even deeper. It's more gripping, more unexpected, and waiting for you right now. Don't hesitate. Click the video on your screen, and I'll see you in the next story.